uncharted, of men not yet in the air, of a world that does not yet know what is coming. Stand on a German airfield in the spring of 1935, and you would feel that silence everywhere. You would see rows of aircraft unlike anything the world had produced before. You would see young men in new uniforms moving with the particular confidence of people who know they are part of something that has never existed before. You would see flags and bunting and the unmistakable energy of a nation that has decided after years of humiliation and restriction and enforced smallness that it is done being small. And somewhere near the center of all of it, you would see a large man in a uniform of his own design, surveying everything with the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for this moment for a very long time. His name was Hermann Goering. He was 42 years old. He was at that moment one of the most powerful men in Germany, and in several meaningful ways one of the most capable. And he was at that same moment already carrying within him the particular combination of pride and blindness that would 10 years later turn everything you were looking at to ash. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what the Luftwaffe was, you have to understand what Germany was in 1933 when Adolf Hitler became chancellor. You have to understand a country that had spent 15 years being told by the rest of the world exactly what it was not allowed to be. The Treaty of Versailles, signed after Germany's defeat in the First World War, had dismantled the German military with a thoroughness that was meant to be permanent. No military aircraft, no military pilots, no air force. The humiliation was deliberate and it was total. What the architects of Versailles did not fully reckon with was that you cannot legislate away what a nation's people already know how to do. And Germany in 1933 was a country whose engineers and designers and industrialists had been thinking about aircraft continuously for 15 years, even while being forbidden to build them for war. At the Messerschmitt Works in Bavaria, a 33-year-old designer of ferocious ambition named Willy Messerschmitt had been building racing planes of extraordinary speed and elegance. At the Junkers factory in Dessau, where Hugo Junkers had been constructing aircraft since before the First World War, the design teams worked on transport planes whose internal dimensions and structural frameworks bore a suspicious resemblance to what a bomber might need. At the Heinkel Works in Rostock, fast mail planes were being developed that any honest observer could see were with minimal modification fighter prototypes. German pilots traveled to the Soviet Union under agreements that both sides preferred not to discuss publicly. They flew military aircraft on Soviet ranges far from Allied observation, maintaining the skills and building the experience that would serve them when the moment came. And the moment came. On March 1st, 1935, Adolf Hitler announced to the world that Germany had an air force, that it had always been building one, that the Luftwaffe existed. The announcement was a violation of the Versailles Treaty, and Hitler made it with the complete confidence of a man who has concluded that nobody is going to stop him. Nobody stopped him. Standing at his side was Goering, resplendent in a uniform he had personally designed, wearing the expression of a man who has just received the thing he most wanted in the world. And in a sense he had, because the Luftwaffe was his, its creation, its command, its future glory. All of it belonged to Hermann Goering. Now, who was this man? If you only know Goering from photographs of his later years, you know a figure that history has made almost into a caricature. Enormously fat, draped in medals he awarded himself, wearing a succession of elaborate uniforms with the slightly unhinged theatricality of a man who has lost all contact with how he appears to other people. A buffoon, a decoration on a dangerous regime. But that is not who Hermann Goering was in 1935. And if you want to understand what went wrong with the Luftwaffe, you have to begin by understanding who he actually was. In the First World War, Goering had been a fighter pilot of genuine distinction. He flew 236 combat missions. He shot down 22 enemy aircraft. He was awarded the Pour le Mérite, which was Germany's highest military decoration, and which a fighter pilot only received after demonstrating repeatedly and without ambiguity that he was among the best in the sky. When Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, was killed in April 1918, it was Goering who eventually took command of Richthofen's famous unit. Not because of politics, because he had earned it. After the war, the man who had that record came home to a Germany that had no use for him. He scraped through the 1920s doing barnstorming work and courier flights in Scandinavia. He married a Swedish aristocrat. He became addicted to morphine after a wound. He drifted through years that were by any measure a hard diminishment for a man who had known what he knew in the cockpit. Then he met Hitler. Then everything changed. And the skills that had made him a fine fighter pilot, combined with a decade of frustrated ambition that had followed, combined with the peculiar loyalty that develops between men who share a very specific kind of danger, produced in Goering, a fierce and nearly unconditional commitment to the Nazi cause and to the man who led it. By 1935, he was second only to Hitler in the German government. He had the Gestapo under his authority. He had the four-year plan. He had the Prussian government. And now he had the Luftwaffe. What he did not have and would never develop was the ability to separate what he knew from what he thought he knew. Goering understood fighter aircraft. He understood the courage it took to fly them and the skill it took to survive in them. He understood at a gut level what it felt like when the enemy was in your sights and the machine responded to your hands with perfect fidelity. This knowledge was genuine and it was earned. What he did not understand and would never understand was strategy at the scale of years. He understood weeks. He understood campaigns. He understood the rapid application of overwhelming force against an enemy who had not yet had time to respond. He understood the kind of war that Germany had just fought in Spain with the Condor Legion, where a small force of superior aircraft had achieved decisive results in a limited theater in a limited time. He did not understand what happened when the theater was not limited, when the time was not limited, when the enemy was not a poorly equipped Republican government in a country the size of Texas, but instead a coalition of industrial powers spanning 3 continents. That limitation would in time kill the Luftwaffe. But in 1935, it was invisible because in 1935, the Luftwaffe was not yet at war with anyone, and the future looked exactly the way Goering needed it to look. The aircraft being built in those years were extraordinary. The Messerschmitt B F-109, which first flew in the autumn of 1935, was a fighter of a quality that stunned the aviation world when it appeared. Its monocoque construction, its enclosed cockpit, its retractable undercarriage, its liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz engine represented a leap forward from the biplane era that had still dominated military aviation only 5 years before. When it appeared in the skies over Spain in 1936, supporting Franco's forces under the banner of the Condor Legion, Allied aviation experts who managed to get close to it came away shaken. The Junkers Ja-87 Stuka was something different entirely. It was not the most advanced aircraft ever built. Its fixed undercarriage was already old-fashioned. Its speed was modest. But what it did with a precision and a psychological intensity that made it something new in the history of warfare. The dive. The shrieking siren mounted on its landing gear activated automatically when the aircraft tilted past a certain angle. The way it came down out of the sky with a wail that seemed designed not just to destroy, but to unmake the will of everyone below. Soldiers who experienced a Stuka attack for the first time described it with a consistency that makes clear this was not just noise. It was fear delivered directly into the nervous system, bypassing every rational defense. You cannot hide from a bomb the way you can hide from a bullet. The wall you are behind the ditch, you are lying in the tree, you are pressed against, none of them are proof against what falls from above. People who had been brave in every conventional sense found themselves unable to function when the Stukas came. This was not a weakness, it was physiology. The Heinkel He 111, with its distinctive elliptical wings and glazed nose, was the backbone of Germany's bombing force. The Dornier Do-17, so slender its crews called it the flying pencil, was a fast medium bomber that could outrun many of the fighters that might oppose it. Together, they gave the Luftwaffe a striking power that no other air force in Europe could match. By 1938, Germany was producing more than 5,000 aircraft a year. By 1939, that figure had climbed past 8,000. The factories at Augsburg and Dessau and Rostock and Hamburg ran continuously. The name Luftwaffe, which had not existed a decade before, had become the most feared word in European military vocabulary. And yet, even then, even in those years of assembly lines and test flights and proud demonstrations, there was a man who was worried. His name was Walter Wever. He was 48 years old in 1935. He had come to the Luftwaffe from the German army, which was in retrospect the source of both his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability in the organization. He had not grown up in the cult of the fighter pilot. He had not accumulated the instinctive conviction shared by Goering and by most of the senior Luftwaffe commanders around him that air power was fundamentally about speed and aggression, and the winning of decisive engagements in the shortest possible time. Instead, he had read Giulio Douhet, the Italian theorist who had argued in the 1920s that the next great war would be decided by aircraft striking deep into enemy territory, destroying the factories and infrastructure that made military power possible. He had read Billy Mitchell of the United States, who had argued the same thing from a different angle and been court-martialed for saying it too loudly. Waver understood what most of his colleagues did not want to think about, that a war against a large industrial power could not be won quickly, and that winning it slowly required the ability to reach far into the enemy's rear and destroy what sustained him. In 1935 and 1936, as the new Luftwaffe was taking shape around him, Waver pushed for something that seemed almost fantastical in its ambition. He called it the Eurobomber, a four-engine long-range strategic aircraft capable of taking off from German territory and reaching the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union deep beyond the Ural Mountains, where Stalin was building the factories and the arsenals that would, in any future war with Germany, produce the weapons that would be used against German soldiers. He commissioned designs from two manufacturers. Dornier produced the Do-19. Junkers produced the Ju-89. Neither aircraft was as capable as the American B-17 Flying Fortress that was being developed across the Atlantic at the same time. But they were real aircraft that flew, and they were the foundation of something that could have been developed over 5 years of careful work into a genuine strategic bombing force. Waver wrote in a paper that his staff would remember for the rest of their lives, words that would prove prophetic in ways that make them almost unbearable to read now. He wrote that air power carries the war into the heart of enemy country from the very first day, that it strikes at the root of the enemy's fighting power, that without the ability to reach that root, an air force could win battles but not wars. He was right. Every word. The Allied strategic bombing campaign that would eventually reduce German industrial output by 50%, that would destroy the fuel production that grounded the Luftwaffe in the last year of the war, that would reach into the very cities where German weapons were made and unmake them piece by piece, vindicated exactly what Waver had written. The Americans and the British proved his thesis with 10,000 aircraft over 4 years, while Germany watched from below, with no equivalent capability to respond in kind. But Waver would not live to see any of it. On the morning of June 3, 1936, he climbed into the cockpit of a Heinkel He-70 at the airfield near Dresden. He was flying to Berlin. It was a routine trip he had made before. He was busy. He was always busy. There were always more meetings, more decisions, more papers requiring his attention. He did not unlock the aileron gust locks before takeoff. The ailerons are the control surfaces on the outer wing, the ones that allow an aircraft to bank and turn and respond to the pilot's commands. When they are locked as they are for safety, while the aircraft is parked on the ground, the plane will fly straight. It cannot turn. It cannot correct. When Waver pushed the throttle forward and the He-70 accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air, the controls did not respond the way they should have. The aircraft could not be recovered. It struck the ground beyond the airfield boundary. Walter Wever was killed instantly. He was 48 years old. The accident report was correct in its technical conclusion: failure to complete pre-flight checks, a locked at the control surface, a moment of inattention that cost a man his life. What the accident report could not capture, what no document could capture, was what that death meant for everything that came after. Goering did not replace Waver with someone who shared his vision. He replaced him with men who were politically reliable, men who agreed with him, men who did not push back when he expressed his fundamental conviction that the Luftwaffe was a tactical weapon for a tactical war, not a strategic weapon for a strategic one. The Eurobomber prototypes were reviewed. The drawings were examined. The production estimates were calculated. And then Goering asked the question that revealed exactly how he understood the purpose of an air force. He asked how many twin-engine bombers Germany could build for every four-engine one. The answer was 2.5. His response was delivered with the finality of a man who has found the answer he was looking for. The Fuhrer, he said, does not ask me how big my bombers are. He asked me how many there are. The Do-19 prototype was scrapped. The Ju-89 prototype was scrapped. The Eurobomber program ceased to exist. Germany committed itself from that moment forward to an air force built around speed and numbers and the winning of short campaigns. An air force built to be unstoppable over France in 6 weeks. Not unstoppable over 4 years. Not unstoppable over 3 continents. Not unstoppable against a coalition of industrial powers whose combined output would within 5 years exceed Germany's by a factor of 4. None of that was visible on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1936 when some paperwork was filed away. The sky outside was clear. The factories were running. The Bf-109s were rolling off the assembly lines with a mechanical perfection that made every aviation observer in the world take notice. The future looked exactly like what Goering needed it to look like. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a decision once it has been made and the door has closed behind it. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of something in motion that cannot be recalled. That silence settled over the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1936, and nobody in Germany could hear it. Nobody perhaps except the ghost of a general who had understood with complete clarity that the war that was coming would not be short, and who had spent his last years trying to build something that could survive it, something that his country had decided in the end it did not need. The pilots were magnificent. The aircraft were extraordinary. The engineers were brilliant. The factories were running around the clock. Everything was in place for a victory of overwhelming, rapid, decisive force. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in Berlin, the blueprints of the only aircraft that might have sustained that victory past the moment when quick victories stopped being possible were gathering dust. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. It fell in 27 days. Norway fell, Denmark fell, Holland fell, Belgium fell. France, the great power that Germany had spent 4 years trying to break in the First World War, fell in 6 weeks. The Luftwaffe was invincible, and the decision that had been made on a Tuesday afternoon in 1936 was still invisible, still silent, still gathering consequences in the dark. There is a particular kind of danger that comes with winning too easily, not the danger of the battlefield, not the danger that comes with bullets and bombs and men who are trying to kill you. That kind of danger a soldier understands. He has been trained for it. He has thought about it in the morning hours before sleep. It lives in a part of the mind that has a name and a shape and a location. The other kind of danger has none of those things. It lives in the space between victories, in the silence after the celebrating is done, in the moment when a man who has been right about everything begins to believe that being right about everything is simply the natural condition of men like him. Hermann Goering stood at the peak of that particular danger in the summer of 1940. France had fallen on June 22nd. The ceremony of surrender had been held with deliberate symbolism in the same railway car where Germany had signed its armistice in 1918. The humiliation of Versailles was in Hitler's telling and in Goering's believing erased. The Luftwaffe had performed beyond any reasonable expectation. The coordination between German armor racing through the Ardennes and German aircraft hitting the road junctions ahead of the tanks destroying French artillery before it could slow the advance, clearing the sky of RAF fighters that were desperately trying to intervene, had been a demonstration of modern warfare that left the rest of the world simultaneously awestruck and terrified. Goering was awarded the Großkreuz des Eisernen Kreuzes, the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, a decoration that had not been given since the First World War. He was made Reichsmarschall, a rank that had been created specifically for him, the highest military rank in German history. He wore it with the satisfaction of a man who has finally received what he always knew he deserved. And standing at the center of all that triumph, elevated by it, surrounded by it, he made a promise. He told Hitler that the Luftwaffe would bring Britain to its knees. He said it with the easy confidence of a man who had just watched his Air Force demolish the strongest military coalition in Europe. He said it without hesitation, without qualification, without the small internal voice that asks whether this time might be different. He said weeks. Hitler believed him. What Goering did not say, and what the men around him did not say either, because nobody in that atmosphere of triumph was going to be the person who introduced doubt into the room, was that Britain was not France. That defeating an army on a continent is a different proposition from defeating an island nation across 20 miles of water. That the RAF had not been destroyed over France had in fact pulled many of its best pilots in its best aircraft back across the channel before the collapse. That Britain had something Germany did not fully understand and did not fully respect, a technology called radar, a chain of stations strung along its southern and eastern coastline, that could detect approaching aircraft from 100 miles away and give fighter command enough warning to put the right planes in the right places before the Germans arrived. Goering had been told about the radar stations. He had been shown reports. He had read summaries prepared by men who understood exactly what those structures meant for any attempt to achieve air superiority over Britain. He had called them boxes with coils. He had said he did not like boxes with coils. He was a World War I fighter pilot who believed that courage and aggression were the decisive factors in aerial combat, and that technology was at best a supplement to those qualities and at worst a distraction from them. It was not an unreasonable belief for a man who had earned his decorations in a war where the decisive factors really were courage and aggression and the skill to put your aircraft where it needed to be before the other man did. It was a belief that belonged entirely to a different war. The Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940, and it revealed with a clarity that should have been impossible to miss the first fundamental structural failure of everything Goering had built. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was a superb fighter aircraft. In a straight fight at the right altitude against a pilot of comparable skill, it could hold its own against anything the RAF possessed. The Spitfire was its equal or near equal in most parameters. The Hurricane was slower but more maneuverable at lower altitudes. Matched against either one, the Bf-109 was a worthy opponent, but the Bf-109 had been built for the war that had just been won, the war in Poland, the war in France. The war where German airfields were close to the fighting and the aircraft could fly multiple sorties a day and return home to refuel and rearm and fly again. In those campaigns, the Bf-109's limited fuel capacity had been a marginal concern. The missions were short. The range was adequate. Over Britain, it was not adequate. Flying from airfields in occupied France, crossing the Channel, reaching the RAF's airfields in southern England, and returning home, the Bf-109 had approximately 20 minutes of useful combat time over England before its fuel state required it to turn back. 20 minutes. Enough for one engagement, perhaps two if they were brief. Not enough to protect the bombers that were supposed to be the whole point of the operation, which flew slower and lower and needed continuous escort over a much longer period. The RAF understood this. The British pilots, fighting over their own country, fighting on a battlefield they had practiced on their whole careers, fighting with the knowledge that if they were shot down over England, they could be back in the air the next morning, while a German pilot in the same situation became a prisoner of war, used the Bf-109's fuel limitation as a weapon. They refused close engagement when it did not suit them. They broke off and returned to their airfields when they needed to. They used the radar network to avoid the parts of the sky where the Bf-109s were waiting for them and to appear in the parts of the sky where the bombers were relatively unprotected. Through August of 1940, the battleground on. The RAF sector stations, the control centers that coordinated fighter response across southern England, were being bombed repeatedly. The system was under strain. The experienced pilots were being worn down. If the pressure had been maintained for another few weeks at the same intensity and against the same targets, the RAF's fighter command might have cracked. Then came the night of August 24th, 1940. A group of Heinkel He-111 bombers navigating in darkness over England drifted off course. Whether through navigation error or simple confusion in the night sky, they released their bombs over London rather than over the industrial and military targets they had been assigned. Bombs fell on civilian areas of the city. People died who were not soldiers and not involved in any war production. Winston Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin the following night. The raid was militarily insignificant. The RAF aircraft available for the mission did not have the payload or the precision to do serious damage to a city the size of Berlin. But the psychological effect on Hitler and on Goering, who had publicly promised the German people that no enemy bomb would ever fall on their capital, was enormous. Hitler was furious. Goering was humiliated. On September 7, 1940, Goering traveled to the French coast in person. He stood on the cliffs above the Channel and looked through binoculars toward England. And he made a decision that historians have been arguing about ever since because it is one of the clearest examples in the history of warfare of a commander substituting his emotional state for his strategic judgment. He ordered the bombing campaign to shift its focus from RAF airfields and sector stations to London. The RAF airfields, which had been on the edge of collapse, were given a respite they desperately needed. Within weeks, the system had recovered. The sector stations that had been bombed repeatedly were repaired or rerouted around. The pressure that had been slowly crushing Fighter Command was lifted. The Battle of Britain did not end on a single day or with a single dramatic confrontation. It wound down through September and October as the losses on both sides accumulated and as the practicalities of the operation made it increasingly clear that air superiority over England was not going to be achieved before the autumn weather made an invasion impossible. Operation Sea Lion was postponed. It would never be revived. It was the Luftwaffe's first defeat, and it happened at least in part because the man at the top had made a decision based on personal embarrassment rather than military calculation. But the Battle of Britain was not the failure that most shaped the outcome of the war. The failure that most shaped the outcome of the war was happening at the same time less visibly in the gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean. And it was a failure born not of a tactical error in the middle of a battle, but of something far more fundamental, the refusal of two branches of the same military to work together because the man in charge of one of them could not bear to share. Admiral Erich Raeder was the commander of the Kriegsmarine Germany's Navy. He was a man of deep professional competence and considerable strategic clarity, and what he understood about Britain's situation in 1940 was something that Goering either did not understand or chose not to think about. Britain was an island. Everything that sustained it, everything that fed its population and fueled its factories and armed its soldiers, everything that kept it in the war had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The convoys that sailed from American and Canadian ports carrying food and oil and steel, and increasingly weapons and aircraft, were the lifeblood of the British war effort. Without them, Britain could not fight. Without them, Britain would eventually have to make terms regardless of how bravely its pilots flew or how resolutely its people endured the bombing. Raeder wanted to cut that lifeline. His U-boats were already doing serious damage to Allied shipping, operating primarily in the North Atlantic, where the convoys had to pass, and where in 1940 and 1941 there were great stretches of ocean beyond the range of any Allied air cover. But submarines hunting alone or even in the wolf packs that Admiral Karl Dönitz was developing with such lethal effectiveness were limited in their ability to find convoys in the vast gray expanse of the ocean. They could not see far enough. They could not cover enough water. Aircraft could, specifically the Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor, could. The Condor had begun its life as a transatlantic passenger aircraft, a four-engine machine of elegant lines designed to carry passengers in comfort from Berlin to New York. When the war began, a small number had been converted into maritime patrol bombers. They were not ideal for the role. The airframe was not designed for the stresses of combat flying and had a tendency under heavy loads or rough landings to develop structural failures. But their range was extraordinary. A Condor flying from a base on the French Atlantic coast could reach far out into the Atlantic, covering patrol areas that no other German aircraft could reach, and return home with fuel to spare. Raeder went to Goering and asked for Condors to be assigned to work with the Kriegsmarine. Goering said no. He said it without particular anger, at least at first. He said it with the smooth confidence of a man who has a clear policy and sees no reason to revisit it. Everything that flies belongs to me. That was the policy. It was not negotiable. The Navy had ships. The Navy had submarines. The Navy could conduct its war with the tools appropriate to its domain. Aircraft were not the Navy's domain. Raeder was not a man who accepted no easily when the stakes were high enough. He was a naval officer of the old school trained in an institution where persistence in the face of institutional resistance was understood to be part of the job. He went around Goering. He found a path directly to Hitler and made his case. He got 12 aircraft, 12 Condors assigned to Kampfgeschwader 40 operating from Bordeaux-Marignac on the French Atlantic coast. When Goering found out what had happened, his response was swift and total. He did not simply express displeasure. He did not issue a reprimand and move on. He cut off all cooperation between the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. Every formal and informal channel through which the two services had been exchanging information and coordinating operations was closed. If the Navy wanted to go behind his back to Hitler, then the Navy could conduct its war without any help from the Air Force. The feud that followed was one of the most damaging in the history of a military that needed above all things to fight as a single coherent force. And those 12 aircraft went to work. The small unit at Bordeaux-Marignac flew its Condors out over the Atlantic and found what they were looking for. Slow merchant ships, heavily laden sailing in convoys that stretched across miles of ocean. The Condors attacked with bombs and with the machine guns mounted in their turrets, and then they radioed positions and headings to U-boat command, which directed the submarines to the intercept points. In less than a year, flying with the aircraft that were structurally marginal, operating with no formal coordination with the submarines because the inter-service communication that Goering had severed had never been properly rebuilt. Kampfgeschwader 40 sank 85 Allied merchant vessels, more than 360,000 tons of shipping. Winston Churchill, reviewing the intelligence reports, called the FW-200 Condor the scourge of the Atlantic. He wrote after the war that the Battle of the Atlantic was the campaign that frightened him most, that it was the one theater where he could see a path to British defeat. 12 aircraft, imagine 200, imagine 500, operating in systematic coordination with Dunitz's submarines, with proper communication protocols, with shared intelligence, with the kind of integrated campaign planning that would have resulted if the man in charge of Germany's Air Force had been willing to consider even briefly that the best way to win a war might not always be the way that preserved his institutional prerogatives. The opportunity existed. It existed clearly and demonstrably, proven by the performance of 12 aircraft with marginal equipment and no formal cooperation. What 12 could do, 500 could have done on a scale that might have decided the war before America entered it. Instead, Goering's ego had closed the door, and Britain breathed. But there was another failure developing simultaneously, one that would prove even more consequential in the long run. A failure not of strategy, but of the most basic function of military leadership, putting the right person in the right job. In 1936, when Goering had needed someone to run the Luftwaffe's technical and procurement operations, the choice he made said everything about how he understood the organization he commanded. Ernst Udet was 40 years old in 1936. He was, in terms of his combat record, one of the finest pilots Germany had ever produced. 62 aerial victories in the First World War, the second highest scoring German ace of the entire conflict. A man who had looked death in the face more times than could be accurately counted, and who had responded each time by putting his aircraft precisely where it needed to be and pulling the trigger at exactly the right moment. He was also, by 1936, a barnstormer, a performer, a man who had spent the years since the war doing air shows and drinking heavily and living entirely in the present tense. He drew cartoons. He told magnificent stories. He was the kind of man who filled whatever room he walked into with energy and laughter, and the particular charisma of someone who has done genuinely extraordinary things and does not need to pretend to be more than he is. What he was not in any way that could be measured or observed was an administrator. He had no experience managing large organizations. He had no background in procurement or industrial planning or the management of development programs involving thousands of engineers and dozens of competing manufacturers and budgets that ran to billions of Reichsmarks. He did not read technical reports with particular care. He did not enjoy the long grinding work of institutional management. He was not built for it, and he had never claimed to be. Erhard Milch, the Luftwaffe's state secretary, understood immediately what was happening. Milch had actually built the organization. He had come from Lufthansa, where he had turned a fledgling civilian airline into the most efficient air carrier in Europe, and he had brought that same organizational intelligence to the Luftwaffe's early development. He was not a combat pilot. He was something rarer, and in the context of a large industrial organization preparing for war, more valuable, a man who understood how to make things happen at scale, on time, within budget. Milch had a difficult relationship with Goering, partly because Goering was suspicious of anyone whose competence might overshadow his own. When Goering chose Udet over Milch for the technical directorship, Milch did not miss the subtext. Goering wanted a friend in that position, a man who would not challenge him, a man whose loyalty was personal and whose authority derived entirely from Goering's patronage. Udet moved into his new office and immediately ran into the limits of what charm and natural talent could accomplish in a job that required neither. He had seen dive bombing demonstrations in the United States in the early 1930s. He had watched American Navy aircraft pitch nearly vertical and release their bombs with extraordinary precision, and he had been transfixed. He had bought 2 Curtiss Hawk IIs with his own money and brought them back to Germany to show Goering. The demonstration had been impressive. The conclusion that Goering and Udet drew from it was not. The conclusion was that every German bomber should be capable of dive bombing. Not the aircraft specifically designed as dive bombers. Not the Stuka, which had been built from the beginning for that purpose. Every bomber. The Heinkel He-111, the Dornier Do-17, the new Junkers Ju-88 that was being developed as a fast medium bomber with a genuine long-range capability. All of them would be required to be able to dive steeply and release their bombs with Stuka-like precision. The engineers received this requirement with reactions that ranged from skepticism to something closer to despair. They explained with the patience that people who understand physics must exercise when dealing with people who do not. That adding dive bombing capability to a large aircraft meant structural reinforcement, which meant added weight, which meant reduced range and reduced bomb load and reduced performance across every parameter that made the aircraft useful. They explained that for a genuinely large aircraft, a four-engine heavy bomber, the requirement was not just impractical, but physically irrational. The forces experienced in a steep dive by an aircraft of that size and weight would require strengthening of a magnitude that would make the resulting machine essentially useless as a bomber. Udet listened to these explanations and issued his requirement again. What followed was a cascade of disasters that consumed resources, engineering talent, manufacturing capacity, and irreplaceable time during the years when Germany most needed all of those things. The Heinkel He-177 was supposed to be Germany's answer to the four-engine strategic bombers that America and Britain were developing. Ernst Heinkel's team had designed an aircraft of genuine capability, four engines, a range that could reach deep into Soviet territory, a bomb load that could do serious damage to industrial targets. It was not perfect, but it was a foundation. It was the kind of aircraft that, developed carefully over several years, could have given Germany a strategic option it desperately needed. Then Udet's requirement arrived. The solution that Heinkel's engineers were eventually forced to adopt was a response to an impossible demand, and it had the quality of all such solutions. It solved the immediate problem while creating a larger one. Instead of four separate engines mounted conventionally, the HE-177 would use paired engines, two Daimler-Benz power plants, coupled together in a single nacelle on each wing, driving a single propeller. From the outside, the aircraft would appear to have two engines. In terms of power, it would have four. What it would also have, and what the engineers knew it would have, and said so and were ignored, was an engine installation of extraordinary complexity, generating extraordinary heat in a compartment where oil lines and hydraulic fluid and electrical systems all shared space with components that ran at temperatures high enough to ignite them. The HE-177 caught fire. It caught fire in tests. It caught fire on operational missions. It caught fire while sitting on the ground. The engines overheated, leaked oil onto exhaust components, and burned with a reliability that the aircraft's performance characteristics singularly lacked. The crews who flew it, when they flew it, called it the Reichsleiter, a name that carried within it equal measures of dark humor and genuine terror. More than 1,000 were eventually built. The number that ever flew operationally with any consistency was a fraction of that. At the same time, the Messerschmitt Me-210 was demonstrating what happens when procurement decisions run ahead of engineering reality. The aircraft was intended to replace the Bf-110 as a heavy fighter and fast bomber. It was ordered into production with characteristic confidence before its test program was complete. When the production aircraft began flying, the problems that the tests had not caught or had caught and not adequately addressed appeared with merciless regularity. At low speeds, the aircraft had a tendency to snap into an unrecoverable spin. Pilots died. Many pilots. The entire production run had to be halted while the aircraft was substantially redesigned as the Me-410 and the existing Me-210s were torn apart and rebuilt at a cost in labor and materials and time that Germany could not afford and could not recover. By 1941, the pattern was clear to everyone who was paying attention and willing to say what they saw. The programs under Udet's direction were not failing in the normal ways that complex engineering projects sometimes fail. They were failing because the fundamental requirements were wrong, set by a man who understood individual aircraft intimately and understood large-scale development programs not at all. Erhard Milch watched it happen. He said what he thought when he could say it. He pushed back where he had authority to push back. He was overruled, marginalized, and his objections were noted and set aside. The one genuine success of these years, the Focke-Wulf FW-190 that appeared in service in 1941 and immediately demonstrated that it was superior to the Spitfire Mark V that had been the RAF's finest fighter, succeeded almost precisely because it had developed with minimal interference from Udet's office. Kurt Tank, its designer, had been given unusual independence. The result was an aircraft that worked the way its designers intended, and that proved by contrast what the programs under direct oversight had failed to achieve. By the autumn of 1941, Ernst Udet was a man being slowly destroyed by what he had done and what he had been unable to undo. He knew, not with the clear self-knowledge of a man who has reviewed the evidence and drawn a conclusion, but with the deeper and more painful knowledge of one who has felt things going wrong under his hands for years and who has been unable to stop them. The He-177 was burning. The Me-210 was killing its pilots. The strategic bombing capability that Germany needed against a war that was no longer short and no longer easy did not exist, and the programs that were supposed to create it were disasters. He called some friends. He told stories from the old war. The first one where the problems had been simple and solvable, and where what a man could do with courage and skill was enough to determine the outcome. He drew some cartoons, a thing he had always been able to do with a natural ease that stood in sharp contrast to everything else about the last 5 years. He laughed a little. On the morning of November 17, 1941, Ernst Udet shot himself in his apartment in Berlin. The official announcement said he had died testing a new weapon. It was a lie, as most official announcements of that kind are. He was given a state funeral with full military honors. Hitler came. Goering delivered the eulogy, speaking of courage and sacrifice and the debt that Germany owed to this man who had given everything in her service. Erhard Milch stood at that funeral and kept his face carefully neutral, the way a professional keeps his face neutral when the situation requires it, regardless of what is happening inside him. That night, in the private diary that he maintained throughout the war, he wrote about the state of the programs he was inheriting, the damage that had been done, the years of delay, the aircraft that burned and the aircraft that killed their pilots, and the strategic capability that did not exist and could not be created quickly now that it was needed. He wrote 3 words: too late. Too late. Outside, November rain was falling on Berlin. The Eastern Front was frozen, and the armies that had swept toward Moscow in June were stalled in mud and ice and Soviet resistance that had not diminished the way everyone had promised it would. The short war that everything had been built for had not happened. The long war that nobody had prepared for was already underway. And the man who had been responsible for preparing Germany's Air Force for that long war was dead in an apartment in the city, and the man who had tried to warn that this was coming was standing in the rain outside a military ceremony, keeping his face neutral, writing 3 words in a private book that nobody important would ever read. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe was no longer failing. It had already failed. The men flying the missions knew it. The men maintaining the aircraft knew it. The commanders writing the reports knew it, and said so in language that became, over months of being ignored, progressively more direct. What none of them knew yet was whether something still in development, something that had survived years of mismanagement and political interference, and the general chaos of an organization at war with itself, could arrive in time to matter. The Soviet Union, which Hitler had told his generals would collapse like a rotten structure when Germany kicked in the door, had not collapsed. It had absorbed losses that would have destroyed any other nation in history and kept fighting. The factories that Stalin had moved beyond the Ural Mountains were producing aircraft and tanks at a rate that Germany's intelligence services had said was impossible, because they had calculated Soviet industrial capacity based on the factories they could see and not the ones that had been disassembled and rebuilt in Siberia beyond the range of any German aircraft. The United States, which Hitler had dismissed as too soft and too divided to mount a serious war effort, had converted its economy to war production with a speed and a scale that belonged by any prior measure in the category of the impossible. The Boeing factory in Seattle, the Douglas plants in California, the Consolidated facility in San Diego, the Bell Works in Buffalo. Across an entire continent untouched by bombing, working 3 shifts around the clock, American industry was producing aircraft at a rate that no European nation could approach, let alone match. By 1943, the United States alone was building more aircraft every month than Germany built in a year. By 1944, the figure would reach 96,000 aircraft annually. One aircraft every 5 minutes, every hour of every day, of every week, of every month of the year. The mathematics of this were not complicated. They were not subject to optimistic reinterpretation or creative accounting or the kind of motivated reasoning that tends to infect military planning when the alternative is confronting an unacceptable truth. The numbers were the numbers. Germany was being outproduced by a factor that no tactical advantage could overcome, no matter how skilled the pilots or how advanced the aircraft. And the aircraft. The aircraft that the Allies were now sending over Germany in formations that darkened the sky. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the consolidated B-24 Liberator, heavy bombers that flew in tight defensive formations, hundreds of aircraft at a time, each one bristling with machine gun positions that created overlapping fields of fire so comprehensive that approaching them head-on was an act that required a kind of courage that bordered on the irrational. The American 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, flew by day. The RAF Bomber Command flew by night, with Lancaster and Halifax aircraft dropping their loads across entire city districts in operations that were not aimed at specific industrial targets, but at the cities themselves, at the workers who lived in them, at the will to continue that sustained any population under sustained bombardment. Hamburg, in July of 1943, was attacked for a week in an operation the RAF called Gomorrah. The incendiary and high-explosive bombs created conditions that meteorologists and fire scientists had theorized about, but never observed at that scale. The fires merged. They created their own wind. The wind fed the fires. A column of superheated air rose from the city center and drew oxygen from the surrounding streets at velocities that reached hurricane force, and the hurricane was made of fire, and 42,000 people died in a week. The Luftwaffe watched this happen from the sky and from the ground, and the men who flew against the bombers understood something with a clarity that was almost beyond bearing. They were fighting a battle they could not win with the tools they had been given, and the tools they needed were sitting in development programs that had been delayed by years of incompetent management, misplaced priorities, and decisions made by people who had confused what they wanted the war to be with what the war actually was. Adolf Galland understood this better than almost anyone. Galland was 31 years old in 1943. He had been flying since before Spain had flown in Poland and France, and the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front had accumulated 104 aerial victories and enough decorations to fill a display case, and had been appointed general of the fighter arm, the officer responsible for Germany's fighter forces, at an age when most men were still trying to figure out what they believed. He was not a man who confused official optimism with operational reality. He flew his own aircraft to the front regularly because he believed that a commander who stopped flying stopped understanding, and he had seen with his own eyes what was happening to the pilots in the aircraft in the organization he was responsible for. He had seen the training hours dropping. He had seen experienced men lost and replaced by boys who were not ready. He had seen the fuel situation tightening and the spare parts becoming harder to source, and the maintenance crews working around the clock on aircraft that needed more than what could be done in a night. He had also seen something else, something that had been in development since the late 1930s, that had survived budget disputes and priority reshufflings in the general chaos of Udet's tenure. And that represented in Galland's assessment and in the assessment of every qualified aviation expert who had seen it the most significant advance in combat aircraft technology since the introduction of the monoplane fighter a decade earlier. The Messerschmitt Me-262 had first flown under jet power in July of 1942. Galland flew it for the first time in May of 1943. He landed, climbed it out of the cockpit, and was asked by the ground crew what it was like. He said it felt as though angels were pushing. He was not given to poetic exaggeration. He was a practical, direct, professionally unsentimental man who had been flying combat aircraft for 7 years. When he used that language, the people around him understood that what he had experienced was not an incremental improvement over existing technology, but something categorically different, something that had crossed a threshold. The Me-262 flew at 870 kilometers per hour. The fastest Allied fighter in 1943 flew at roughly 720. The gap sounds modest in absolute terms until you understand what it means in practice. An aircraft that is 150 kilometers per hour faster than its opponent does not simply win more engagements. It dictates the terms of every engagement. It chooses when to fight and when to disengage. It cannot be caught from behind. It can attack and break away before the opponent has fully registered what happened. The defensive systems that bomber crews had developed over years of operational experience, the tight formations, the overlapping fields of fire, the weaving gunners, all of them had been designed around the closing speeds of propeller-driven fighters. Against an aircraft arriving 150 kilometers per hour faster, those systems needed to be completely reimagined, and the crews flying the missions would not have time to reimagine them. The armament was four 30mm Mk-108 cannons. A single hit from one of those rounds could bring down a B-17. A burst of 2 or 3 hits was enough to destroy any aircraft flying. American bomber crews who survived encounters with operational Me-262s in 1944 and 1945 described the experience with a consistency that reveals how thoroughly it overturned everything they had learned. The aircraft appeared at the edge of perception, passed through the formation at a speed that made tracking almost impossible, and was gone before the engagement had fully registered. The gunners who tried to follow it found their turrets rotating through empty sky. Gallon went to Goering in the summer of 1943 with a request and a recommendation. The request was straightforward: accelerate the Me-262 into production as a fighter, immediately prioritizing it above every other development program. The recommendation was equally straightforward: deploy it against the American bombing formations, where its speed advantage would be most decisive and where inflicting serious losses on the B-17 groups would force a strategic reconsideration that might slow the entire Allied bombing campaign. Goering listened. He passed the recommendation up. And then in November of 1943, Adolf Hitler came to see the aircraft. The visit to the testing facility at Insterburg in East Prussia was intended as an inspection and demonstration. Hitler was shown the Me-262 in detail. Its specifications were presented. Its capabilities were outlined. And Hitler asked his question, the question that would echo through the rest of the war in the voices of every engineer and every pilot and every commander who had to work around its consequences. He asked whether the aircraft could carry bombs. Willie Messerschmitt, who was present and who understood that the wrong answer would end the program's priority status, said yes. In principle, 2 bomb racks could be fitted beneath the fuselage. Each rack could carry a 250-kilogram bomb. Hitler's response was immediate, and it was final. He said this was the high-speed bomber he had been demanding for years. He said the aircraft would be designated a bomber. He said it would be produced and deployed in that role. The room was silent in the way that rooms go silent when something irreversible has just happened, and everyone present knows it, and nobody is going to say so. The officers who were there understood what Hitler did not understand or understood and would not allow to be said to him. The Me-262 as a bomber was a machine that sacrificed everything that made it extraordinary in exchange for a capability that it could perform less effectively than aircraft specifically designed for the purpose. Its speed made accurate bomb aiming nearly impossible without equipment it did not have. Its bomb load was a fraction of what a conventional bomber could carry. As a fighter, it was a revolution. As a bomber, it was an expensive, complicated aircraft delivering modest payloads with poor accuracy. Erhard Milch heard about the decision within hours and said in a meeting whose attendees would remember the moment for the rest of their lives that even the youngest child could see this was a fighter and not a bomber. The remark was reported to Goering. Milch's authority over aircraft production was subsequently reduced. Months passed. The Me-262's production priority was reorganized around its bomber role. The modifications needed to carry bombs were incorporated into the production design. Engineering resources were redirected. And in those months, the Allied bombing campaign continued without the one weapon that might have significantly disrupted it. Gallon fought the decision through every channel available to him. He wrote reports. He requested meetings. He told anyone who would listen, and some people who would not, that the decision was strategically indefensible and that the cost of it would be measured in German cities and German lives. He was by temperament and by career not a man who made these arguments quietly. The arguments were heard and rejected. Eventually, after months of internal conflict that consumed senior Luftwaffe officers in disputes that produced no useful outcome, while the factories burned and the cities burned and the pilots died, the decision was partially reversed. The Me-262 would be produced in both versions. Some would be fighters, some would be the high-speed bombers that Hitler had specified. But partially reversed is not the same as reversed. The production delays had already accumulated. The manufacturing facilities that would have been building Me-262 fighters in the spring and summer of 1944 had been building something else, or building nothing, because the priority disputes had created confusion in the procurement chain or had been destroyed by Allied bombing that had identified German aircraft production as its primary strategic target. When the Me-262 began reaching operational units in meaningful numbers in the autumn of 1944, the context in which it was being deployed was not the context in which it might have been decisive. The Normandy invasion had succeeded in June. The Red Army was advancing along a front of hundreds of kilometers. Romania had switched sides in August, cutting Germany off from the oil fields at Ploesti that had been providing a significant fraction of its aviation fuel. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had already destroyed enough of Germany's synthetic fuel production that the Luftwaffe was beginning to ground aircraft because there was nothing to put in their tanks. To understand what Jagdgeschwader 44 was fighting to hold back in those final months, it is necessary to go back to the moment when the war in the West was decided. Back to the morning of June 6, 1944, nearly a year before JG-44 flew its first mission when the Allied invasion of Normandy put 156,000 soldiers ashore on 5 beaches in a single day, protected by an air umbrella so comprehensive that the senior Allied air commander had said there would be no meaningful German air response over the beaches. He was right. The Luftwaffe's response to the largest amphibious operation in history was 2 aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Priller and his wingman flew a single strafing pass along Sword Beach, fired their guns, and returned to base. That was the entire contribution of the Air Force that had conquered Europe in 4 years to the defense of occupied France on the day that determined the outcome of the war in the West. Priller, returning to base, reportedly said that he had just flown the most pointless combat mission of the war. He was right about the outcome. He was wrong about the nature of what he had done. Because what Priller and his wingman had done flying their 2 aircraft over that impossible beach on that impossible morning is something that the entire institutional failure of the previous 4 years had made inevitable. They had done what pilots do. They had flown when there was nothing left to fly and fought when there was nothing left to fight with, and refused to do nothing simply because doing something could not change the outcome. Then came a decision that was, by the standards of the regime in its final months, almost inexplicably reasonable. And for Galland, a man who had spent 2 years being told his judgment was wrong by people whose judgment was visibly destroying the organization he had given his career to, it carried within it an irony that required no commentary. The man who had been removed from command for arguing that the Me-262 must be used as a fighter was now being given a unit of Me-262 fighters. The man whose reports had been ignored was now being handed the evidence that his reports had been right. Hitler authorized Galland to form a special fighter unit equipped entirely with Me-262s, staffed entirely by volunteers of his own choosing, designated Jagdgeschwader 44. The unit would be everything Galland had argued for since 1943. It would arrive in February of 1945, and the war would end in May. What Galland assembled was unlike any military unit before or since, not because of the aircraft, extraordinary as they were, because of the men. He selected pilots from across the Luftwaffe's combat units, men whose records spoke for themselves in the only language that mattered in that world. Gerhard Barkhorn, who had accumulated 301 aerial victories, the second highest total in the history of aviation. Heinz Baer, with 220 victories in a career that stretched from the first days of the war. Johannes Steinhoff, who had been flying combat missions since Spain, and whose understanding of aerial tactics was as sophisticated as any officer in the Luftwaffe. Others of comparable record men, who between them represented the accumulated combat experience of an organization that had been fighting continuously for nearly 6 years. They were called the Squadron of Experts, and the name was not modesty. They were the distillation of everything the Luftwaffe had learned in a decade of combat, concentrated into a single small unit with the finest aircraft Germany had ever built. In combat, Jagdgeschwader 44 was devastating. The Me-262s attacked American bomber formations with an effectiveness that stunned the crews who survived and the commanders who read the after-action reports. P-51 Mustang escort pilots, who had spent years mastering the art of protecting B-17 formations, found themselves unable to intercept aircraft that were simply fundamentally beyond their ability to catch in level flight. The bomber's defensive systems, the tight formations, and the overlapping gun positions that had made the 8th Air Force's daylight raids survivable through years of grinding attrition were significantly less effective against an attacker arriving at closing speeds that reduced the engagement window to seconds. Gallon's pilots attacked destroyed and broke away before the escort fighters could respond, again and again. In engagements that demonstrated, with a clarity that required no interpretation, exactly what the Me-262 could have done if it had been deployed 12 months earlier, in the numbers that would have been available if the production program had not been delayed by the fighter-bomber dispute against formations that had not yet learned the partial countermeasures that experience was now teaching. But there were never more than 60 or 70 operational Me-262s in Jagdgeschwader 44 at any one time. Against the 8th Air Force, which routinely sent 500 to 1,000 bombers on a single mission, escorted by hundreds of P-51, 60 aircraft of any capability could inflict losses and cause disruption, but could not change outcomes. The mathematics that had been running against Germany since 1942 had not changed. The ratio of production had not changed. The fuel situation had not improved. The pilot replacement problem had not been solved. And the Me-262 itself had limitations that its extraordinary speed could not compensate for. The Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines that powered it had been designed and built in a country that had lost access through the progress of the war and the effectiveness of Allied strategic bombing to the high-temperature alloys that turbine engines required to survive sustained operation. Nickel, chromium, cobalt, the metals that allow turbine blades to maintain their integrity at the temperatures generated in a jet engine's core. Germany did not have enough of them and could not get more. The resulting engines ran hot, and they ran unreliably, and they wore out quickly. The design specification called for a service life of 25 hours before overhaul. In practice, in the units flying from German airfields in the winter of 1944 and 1945, actual engine life averaged closer to 12 hours. Gallon disclosed this figure to Allied interrogators after the war with the flat candor of a man who has moved past the point of protecting anyone's reputation, including his own. 12 hours. Every mission was a calculation of whether the engines would last until the aircraft was back on the ground. And the ground itself had become a vulnerability. Allied commanders, and particularly the P-51 pilots, who flew escort for the bombing formations, understood quickly that the Me-262 could not be engaged on its own terms. In level flight in a turning fight at any altitude, where the two aircraft were both operating in their designed envelopes, the Me-262 was untouchable. But it was not always in its designed envelope. It was sometimes on the runway engines, warming, preparing to take off. It was sometimes in the landing pattern, slow and committed to a fixed flight path, the moment of maximum vulnerability for any aircraft. American pilots began to patrol the airfields where Me-262s were based. They would orbit at altitude outside the range of the anti-aircraft guns that protected the fields, and they would wait. When the Me-262s appeared below, climbing away from the runway at the speed they needed to build before their extraordinary performance became available, the P-51s came down. It was not elegant. It was not a test of the finest capabilities of either aircraft. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, the kind of thinking that characterized the American approach to the air war throughout. If the problem cannot be solved directly, change the problem. If the aircraft cannot be caught in the air, catch it on the ground. If the pilot cannot be beaten in a dogfight, wait until he is doing something other than dogfighting. Gallon recognized the tactic and respected it in the way that professionals respect competence in their opponents, regardless of which side it serves. He instituted procedures to protect his aircraft during the vulnerable phases of flight, dedicated propeller-driven fighters to fly top cover over the airfields, while the Me-262s took off and landed. It helped. It was not enough. By the spring of 1945, the mathematics had completed their work. German cities were being bombed around the clock by formations that no longer faced serious opposition. The fuel shortage that had been developing since Romania changed sides had become critical. Aircraft sat on airfields unable to fly, not because they were damaged or unserviceable, but because there was no aviation fuel to put in them. Pilots who had been trained for 100 hours or 50, or in some cases 30 in aircraft that were fundamentally different from the Me-262 they were being asked to fly were dying in accidents that a more experienced pilot would have survived. The men of Jagdgeschwader 44 flew their missions. They took off in disguise that belonged in every practical sense to their enemies. They attacked formations that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude. They scored victories that would have been celebrated as extraordinary achievements in the early years of the war, and that in the spring of 1945 were simply entries in a ledger that was never going to balance. Heinz Baer flew his final mission in a Me-262 and landed in a field because the airfield had been overrun. Gerhard Barkhorn was injured in a crash and spent the last weeks of the war in a hospital. Johannes Steinhoff survived a takeoff accident that burned him so severely that his face required reconstructive surgery over years of subsequent procedures. He lived. He rebuilt. He eventually became one of the founding figures of the post-war West German Air Force and served as chairman of NATO's military committee, the kind of life that only becomes possible when the war finally ends and the survivors are allowed to become something other than what the war required. Galland himself surrendered to American forces in May of 1945 and was treated by the fighter pilots, who had been his opponents for 5 years, with the particular respect that exists between professionals in violent trades who have tested each other at the extremes of what their craft requires. He was interrogated. He was candid. He told his interrogators exactly what had gone wrong with the Luftwaffe in the organized and analytically precise manner of a man who had been watching it happen and trying to stop it for years, and who had in the aftermath of the catastrophe nothing left to protect except the truth. He told them about the pilot training. He told them about the fuel. He told them about the Me-262 and the months that had been lost to the fighter-bomber dispute. He told them about the engine life. He said that his unit had been averaging 12.5 hours of engine life in their Me-262s at the end against a design specification of 25, and he said it without drama because it was simply a fact that explained other facts. He said what every man in that room already knew and had known for 2 years. He said the aircraft had come after the pilots who could have flown it to full effect were gone, and the fuel to run it was gone, and the window in which it could have changed anything had closed. Hermann Goering, stripped of every position and decoration by Hitler in the last weeks of the war, captured by American forces, tried at Nuremberg for crimes that went far beyond aviation policy, was sentenced to death. He swallowed a cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled execution. He was 53 years old, and the empire he had built and commanded and failed and finally surrendered was 12 years old and gone. Erhard Milch, who had seen what was coming and said so and been overruled for years, was tried separately for the use of slave labor in the aircraft production programs he had managed. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, later reduced. He was released in 1954 and lived until 1972, long enough to see the aircraft that had come too late become the standard by which all subsequent fighters were measured, long enough to see the jet age that German engineers had pioneered become the foundation of every air force in the world. Walter Weber had been dead since 1936. The bombers he had wanted were never built. The war he had understood was coming arrived exactly as he had understood it would, and was fought without the tools he had tried to create. His name appears in the histories and footnotes and in chapters about roads not taken, and the question his career poses has never been satisfactorily answered. What would have happened if he had not forgotten to unlock a single control surface on an ordinary Tuesday morning? Nobody knows. History does not deal in counterfactuals. It deals in what happened and what resulted. What happened was this. An air force of extraordinary capability, manned by pilots of extraordinary courage, built by engineers of extraordinary intelligence, destroyed itself from the inside through a series of decisions that had nothing to do with the enemy and everything to do with pride, with personal loyalty placed above professional competence, with short-term thinking applied to long-term problems, with the human tendency to believe that what has worked before will work again, even when the conditions have fundamentally changed. The Luftwaffe is studied today in business schools and organizational psychology programs in military staff colleges. Not primarily because of its aircraft, which were remarkable, or its pilots, which were exceptional, but because of what it demonstrates about what happens when the people with power stop listening to the people with knowledge. When the answer to an uncomfortable truth is not engagement but silence. When being right matters less than being loyal. When the war you have planned for becomes the war you insist on having, even as the war you are actually fighting requires something entirely different. The Me Too 62 is still flying. Reproductions have been built. Originals have been restored. It appears at air shows where people who never saw it in combat stand and stare at its lines and feel something that resists easy description, a recognition that they are looking at something that crossed a threshold, that it stands at the boundary between one era and everything that came after. It arrived at exactly the moment when none of that was enough. The war had already written its verdict. The aircraft was simply the last piece of evidence. The men who had built it were dead or imprisoned or trying to explain themselves to interrogators in comfortable rooms far from the airfields. The men who had flown it were scattered across hospitals and prisoner of war camps and the farm fields where they had landed when there was nowhere else to go. And the aircraft, the extraordinary aircraft that represented everything German engineering could achieve when it was allowed to achieve it, sat on abandoned runways waiting for the people who would come to study them. They would be studied for decades. They still are. Not because anyone needs to know how to build a Messerschmitt anymore, but because the question the Luftwaffe poses has never stopped being relevant. It is the question of what happens to any organization in any century when the people with authority decide that loyalty matters more than competence, that comfort matters more than truth, and that the war they plan for is the only war they are willing to fight. Germany answered that question between 1933 and 1945 at a cost that cannot be calculated. The answer has not changed. It never does. And the sky cleared at last of the sound of engines was silent. Not the silence of waiting, not the silence of preparation, not the silence of a force that has not yet revealed itself. Just silence. The silence of something finished.